Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan, and we're back with The American Left, From Liberalism to Despotism, on to lecture number 3 today, The Origins of the Radical Left.
Let's start with a thought experiment. Take, for example, a man who works in a cubicle under fluorescent lights. He presses a button that makes a widget go into a widget on his computer. He's not interested in his work. He just does it for the paycheck so that he can drive home, get a case of beer, sit down in front of his TV, flip on Netflix, open up his phone, do some sports gambling, go to sleep, do it again every day until he dies. That doesn't sound like a very fulfilling life. If you looked at classic philosophers like Plato or Aristotle, they're going to say this man is not pursuing human excellence. He is not living to the fullest of his potential. If you look at the teaching of Jesus, he would say, how could this man be loving his neighbor? All he does is go work a meaningless job and then pleasure himself at night watching TV, frittering away his time, getting drunk, and then doing it again. The American founders would say this man lacks citizen virtues. He lacks industry. He lacks exertion. He's not doing anything to better himself or his country. What's funny about this is the description, this thought experiment I gave, is actually very akin to an example that Herbert Marcuse, a radical leftist, made in critiquing modern American society. There's something compelling about Marcuse's critique of this man in a gray flannel suit who works an alienated job and then spends his life in isolation, frittering his time away on petty pleasures. But what does Marcuse propose as an answer? That's where he's going to differ from Plato, Aristotle, Jesus, and the American founders.
Yes, I remember actually reading some of the New Left writers when taking the course here as a graduate student at the college. And that was what struck me the most was you start reading them and they're making all the right criticisms of what is happening in American society, and you're agreeing with them until they get to the solutions. And when they get to the solutions, you're like, no, you got it wrong.
That's right. They're very good critics of the problems in modern America. They're very bad at prescribing solutions. So there's two major classes of the radical left that Dr. Slack discusses in today's course. And they, just like the liberals rejected the founders, the radicals rejected the liberals. They criticize the liberals for saying we're going to create a better society. The existentialists, one of the two major groups, criticize the liberals for giving us things like communism and fascism and the atomic bomb. Hey, you say you're trying to create a better world, and then you've created technology that can vaporize hundreds of thousands of people at a time. That doesn't sound better to me. So the existentialists criticize the liberals on the basis of human beings are mortal and they're going to die. They make everything about man's eventual death, and they want to pursue a life that is filled with richness, meaning, and purpose. Of course, the problem is they are still rejecting nature. They're not looking to nature or religion as a standard for what provides richness, meaning, or purpose. And then on the other hand, you have the critical theorists led by the Frankfurt School that features thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and Max Horkheimer, all of whom Dr. Slack discusses in this lecture. And they say the purpose of philosophy is to constantly critique politics, not to become involved in politics, but to constantly point out its contradictions and what's wrong about it. And that's where we get Marcuse saying, you've built this capitalist society that has unprecedented prosperity, and what do people do? They expend all their energy on a job that they don't care about, that seems meaningless, that's gray and bland, and then they drink beer and watch TV, and they do it over and over again until they die. And what's the point of that?
And the Frankfurt School is important, and for our listeners, you should pay attention specifically to that part, because the Frankfurt School, which develops in Germany, they are the ones that develop critical theory, which ends up looking at society and structures in society that are unjust, and the idea that American society was patriarchal, racist, sexist, and homophobic. All of that actually comes from the Frankfurt School already back in the 1960s. It starts obviously in academia, and we don't start seeing it hitting main culture until later, but that's a subject for a future lecture. But start paying attention to what's happening already in the 60s with the Frankfurt School.
That's right. So if you think about modern sexual promiscuity, transgenderism, gay pride parades, the rejection of the nuclear family, you can trace the roots in modern America back to the existentialists and the critical theorists, as Dr. Slack will explain.
If this course is helping you to understand the ideas of the left and where this radical movement comes from, I encourage you to get the DVD for the course. So if you go to hillsdale.edu/course, again, that's hillsdale.edu/course, you can get a DVD box set of the course for a tax-deductible donation of $100 or more. That donation will help us to make more online courses and to share the online courses with more people across the country, including this course, The American Left from Liberalism to Despotism, which is such an important topic for Americans to learn today. Now let's turn to Dr. Slack on Lecture 3, The Origins of the Radical Left.
Many conservatives like to trace problems in the country to the 1960s radicals. But that leads to a question of where did the 60s radicals come from? And I think the best way to understand that is the criticisms across those same academic fields we looked at last lecture, the criticisms of the liberals in those fields that moved many of the students in what would be called the New Left to oppose liberalism. The first is philosophy. In philosophy, we find the rise of two schools in the American university for the first generation to go, I wouldn't say in mass, but large numbers to go to college. The first is existentialism, and the second is critical theory. The primary criticism of liberalism by the radicals is that it failed its own test of utility. In fact, they refer to liberalism as the god that failed. The idea is that the liberals really were believers in a kind of leftism, whether it was progressivism and absolutes or communism. And with the revelations of Stalinism, the starvation of the Ukrainians, and the implosion of communism as a horrible regime, many of the liberals lost their faith in what had been a political god. And insofar as their god had died, everybody else's god had to die too. And so that's what motivated the liberals. The existentialists said that liberals failed their own test of utility in that liberalism was now irrelevant as a philosophy. They looked at some of the innovations of science after World War II, during World War II. And it's interesting, the liberals had promised that this new rationalistic point of view would save the world, would improve the world. And yet it was the same technology that had produced the atom bombs or the more efficient extermination of people in bureaucracies. They also condemned the liberals for their obvious hypocrisy on civil rights or on the family and sexual liberation or on Vietnam. The liberals had always talked about the accumulation of evidence would lead to improvement in society. But what about the questions where you couldn't wait for the results to come in? When it came to something like the atom bomb in the 1940s and 50s, many of the existentialist writers were saying literally the existence of humanity was at stake. This wasn't something to where you could accumulate more evidence. Rather, you had to make determinations. And philosophy, the very field that ought to answer broad questions, was the field that had imploded because it had tried to imitate the quantitative sciences and now took pride in its inability to answer those same questions. So where did this come from? Radicals in existentialism. And in America, it was those professors who had introduced Heidegger or Jasper's existentialism to American college students. People like William Barrett. If you look up his book, Irrational Man, he introduces students to existentialist philosophy, and this became a commonly assigned text in American universities. His criticism of liberalism is that the liberals no longer had faith in philosophy, and so they were trying to become a quantitative science. They felt guilty for not being able to deliver the goods, as it were, the same way that the hard sciences could, meaning an increase in power. Philosophers then sought to become scientists or specialists. They celebrated the turn to the quantification of human phenomena, and they would slowly aggregate information and thereby justify their role as professionals. The liberals had celebrated what they called the end of ideology, with Arthur Schlesinger, Daniel Bell. They said that what made them superior was they no longer believed in absolutes. But the radicals challenged the psychology of the end of ideology. Rather, they said that the celebration of the end of ideology really was simply a way of divorcing the life of the mind from actual life, that it wasn't truly empirical. Think about some of the questions that you would ask and the answers that you would come to that would help you live a life. Certain goals or pursuits, even utopian ideals and visions that would inspire you and give you hope to live your life. These were the things the liberals always shunned. So, for example, let's say you're a college student and you are coming into college and at the rise of analytic philosophy in the mid-century, which had tried to make a science out of language or out of philosophy. And you start asking your professor questions that have been asked for 2,000 years. Things like, what's the good life? What's the source of evil? Is there justice in the world? Is there anything right by nature? Is there a God? And the liberal professor is going to look at you and say, those are questions for therapy. Those are religious questions to be answered in counseling. And so the students very much took to the existentialist philosophers who could at least claim to answer those questions, as opposed to dismiss them or to simply say that they were too high for human intelligence. Also think about the way the liberals handled problems that were key problems in society. They said that we would handle problems incrementally, instead of looking to absolutes to understand fragmentation in society. For example, a class distinction, a race distinction, a religious distinction. The liberal would say, the Marxist is wrong to presuppose that there is a fight going on between two classes, labor and management, the capitalist, the proletariat. Rather, what we need is an expert in economics, and we will send this expert to a particular factory to address a particular grievance that labor has against management. And thereby, we will answer all these questions on a case-by-case basis. You are mistaken to abstract from the particular case and move to a structural description of the problems of society. And the radicals said, aha, the end of ideology is nothing more than an ideology that will preserve the status quo and the power relations that currently exist in the status quo. And what we really need is radical structural change. And so the existentialist professors, and you could look at many of them at the time, Marjorie Green, William Barrett, Hubert Dreyfus, Walter Kaufmann, they argued for a return to a kind of ancient philosophy. And so they forwarded the idea of a broad philosophy instead of becoming a niche specialist that the professor prided himself on. Liberal professors prided themselves on only addressing the facts, ma'am, never the values. And the existentialist professors forwarded the idea, in the words of Barrett, of a, quote, total vision of man and the cosmos. They celebrated the return to fundamental human questions that were perennial. They weren't going to be addressed once and for all or in a slow aggregation of facts the way you could in a hard science, but questions like a fundamental anxiety all humans faced in the face of death, the idea of the herd mentality of the masses, and the question of how you should live your life. And the existentialist would conclude that you could answer those questions and that there was an authentic way that human beings could live. William Barrett returned to the Socratic question of know thyself, a kind of passion for existence. He said the professor shouldn't be deformed. Rather, the professor should profess a certain way of life. Again, compare this to the liberal professor who takes pride in the fact that his students don't know whether he's liberal or conservative and doesn't know what his opinions are at all. Rather, the professor should profess his own chosen way of life, similar to the way that ancient Greek philosophers did. Existentialism focuses on the individual and certain structures of being in the individual and forwards an argument for the best way of life. If I were to summarize this in a sentence, it would be this. Insofar as human beings always have an anxiety towards their own death, existentialists argued that human beings should incorporate the fact of their looming death into every decision that they make in life. And that will add a kind of richness and a sense of meaning and purpose to human existence. The second philosophical school that will challenge liberalism is critical theory. The critical theorists would challenge the structural inequalities in society. They would argue that the kind of psychological repression we find under modern liberal society is really a product of the social structure itself. The Frankfurt School argued that we need to have a historical consciousness. The liberals had argued against absolutes in this abstract way, but in reality, they always stole in through the back door their own views of what the good society was, but could not defend those views, in fact, refused to defend those views under this myth that they only talked about the facts and never values. So what was the Frankfurt School? The Frankfurt School, which originates critical theory, surrounded Frankfurt and a group of Marxists in the Weimar period in Germany. There was Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm. These were Marxists who began to challenge their own presuppositions of Marxism. They argued that something had gone wrong with the Soviet system. Rather, when Stalin came into power, he had introduced his own nationalist view of what a great Russian people should be. Socialism in one country, he called it. In the Frankfurt School, they argued that something had gone wrong where communism had introduced its own kind of fascism. And so they went back to the drawing board. They said the real problem was that Marxism itself had become a kind of vapid orthodoxy, and they focused on other issues, such as repression and human psychology. The Frankfurt School would argue that liberalism itself was the culmination of that 2,000 years of Western philosophy. There was no real break with, say, John Dewey. And in fact, all the Frankfurt School thinkers had some critique of John Dewey that they made. Their argument was Western logic itself was responsible for the psychological repression and the political oppression that they saw in Nazi Germany, as well as in the Soviet Union, as well as in the United States, which they claimed was little different than the Soviet Union in some key aspects. So they wanted a critical theory. Critical meaning, instead of philosophy as something merely positive, the aggregation of facts for the greater control of society. They wanted to be much more critical, to ask the question of, to what ends are we going to employ this technology and these advancements? If philosophy ignores politics as something like an impartial science, that meant it might actually serve the ends of politics. So if you look at the liberal scientists, they simply employed their knowledge for the ends of napalm in Vietnam. If philosophy becomes political explicitly, then it may become fascistic. It simply serves a political end. And so the answer of the critical theorist was a constant critique to expose the contradictions between a society's stated ends, its values, and the conditions that limited the freedoms of its own individual citizens. To give you an example, in the West, they had celebrated individual freedoms. But Marcuse would point out, is it true that individuals can be free if they're constantly repressed psychologically? And so the critical theorists aspired to, once their severe critique was done, again, of the conditions that inhibited the values of reason and freedom, it would be the creation of some kind of a utopian ideal. Maybe not something that science could serve concretely in the ends of, but something that might inspire people to constantly challenge the conditions that limited their freedoms. So they would celebrate certain broad visions or utopianism. The liberals had condemned utopianism as not being pragmatic or practical, whereas the critical theorists argued the utopian visions and ideals were necessary so that people could question their society and they could change the conditions that limited their freedom. Adorno, in his own description, when he studied American values, he'd studied something called the fascist personality. The argument was liberalism, which claimed to oppose fascism, really wasn't that far behind, and many of the emigres from Nazi Germany made the same claim. Liberalism and its inability to defend its own way of life really would be chewed up by totalitarian regimes. And so the fascist personality, argued Adorno and Marcuse, was really produced by a patriarchal, racist society, and that was America. Adorno argued that Americans celebrated colorblindness, but there was a kind of racism that infected American society. It was also sexist and classist, and as Marcuse would argue, homophobic. The second school of thought, so we look at philosophy that has an existentialist movement and critical theory. We now move to psychology. The radicals in psychology challenged Freud's understanding and B.F. Skinner's understanding of the human mind. And in what was called a third force psychology, the psychologist argued that we can now incorporate values, not just facts. Freud had argued that values only betrayed a neurotic mind because there were no such things as right in nature. Rather, the third force psychologists, people like Paul Goodman, Abraham Maslow, argued we could have a new scientific study of the human mind that incorporated ethics and these values.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind. by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
The more radical thinkers in third force psychology directly challenge Freud. Some can trace them to a rather odd figure, Wilhelm Reich, who had inspired Marcuse, Norman O. Brown, Paul Goodman. The criticism that Reich made of Freud was that Freud's own way to heal the human being, free association, whereby the individual would become conscious of the channeling of what were unconscious instincts in drives in their behavior. Once the individual became conscious of this drive, the individual would not act then on the repressed sexual desire. Rather, the individual would talk about them. So it was a talking cure, and it took a long time, and you had to pay a lot of money for this insight. The problem, though, said Reich, and Marcuse agreed, was that by renouncing this repressed drive, the individual would not actually overcome it. In the understanding of Wilhelm Reich, that repression was actually anchored in the individual, in these hardened muscles. He called it armoring. And so the individual was still repressed, whether they were conscious of that fact or not. You had to distinguish between talking and acting. And Reich promised to liberate those individuals. And you see the dilemma. Reich had said, just because someone is conscious of the repressed drive, it doesn't mean that they're freed from the fascist personality or character structure that he said was inseparable from this fascist and liberal order. And so the radicals in psychology challenged liberalism as essentially being a kind of fascism. One of the most famous writers among the student radicals was Paul Goodman, who was in some ways a Reichian in psychology. He developed his own psychotherapy. Paul Goodman was a New York Jewish intellectual. He was married with children, and yet he was bisexual. He was a polymath. He is known for his inventions in architecture, city planning, psychotherapy, but also his poetry. In his book, 5 Years, he talks about wandering the city looking for gay prostitutes. He was fired from 3 jobs for propositioning young males in those colleges. And it would be Paul Goodman's book, Growing Up Absurd, that would be called The Bible of the New Left in the 1964 Berkeley free speech movement. He argued that liberal society, in its attempt to adjust all the individuals in society, had actually created an awful environment for liberals. Rather, the liberals believed that they would understand human beings not as individuals, but in mass, and that they could use their knowledge of human instincts to mold them into any outcome that they wanted. And Goodman said this was particularly striking in education. He said any educator knows that children are radically different. And that means that you know a child's excellences and limitations as you know that child is an individual. But the liberals celebrated the mass instruction and education of these children. And he said it had created an absurd society. It was a rat race. He said it was a culture, quote, against human nature. It meant that these children were educated to be consumers, that they weren't educated to ask grand questions about life. He looked at the family structure. He said the men were all effeminate. They were in the kitchen doing dishes. You could look at the movie Rebel Without a Cause and James Dean's father who's wearing an apron washing dishes. The idea is the man was emasculated in liberal society and focused towards consumerism. In a famous novel of the period, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, the man would put on his gray flannel suit, take his briefcase, go off and work in a soulless cubicle the rest of the day, and then would come home. What did the wife do? Well, she herself was stunted. She was a caged songbird. She would store her liquor at the bottom of the laundry hamper. She wasn't allowed to explore herself. And the children, again, were not allowed to explore themselves either, in a kind of leave it to beaver mold, but not with the nostalgic air of celebration. Rather, this was the society of American repression, boxed American houses in these boxed suburbs with people going off to work into the cities. And so this was the rat race of deficient goals. Goodman said that proper human growth for an individual requires the proper environment, and that would mean radical structural change. Radical political solutions versus the liberals' compromise, a kind of corporate rule. What did this mean for Goodman? It meant race integration, radical changes in society to overcome a systemic racism, as opposed to the liberals addressing racism on an individual or a case-by-case basis. It meant city planning, radical city planning, to where cities would become self-sufficient in a sense once again, growing some of their own food, doing away with the bisecting of cities through Eisenhower's Highway Act. It would mean an ecology movement for conservation. It would mean a radical limiting of monopolies that had taken over because of liberal state capitalism. Most importantly, Paul Goodman and Herbert Marcuse introduced, and we'll see this in a later lecture, the sexual revolution. The argument was sexual repression had led to a fascist character structure, and so individuals, children, need to be liberated so they could explore themselves and their erotogenic zones early on in life, and once they hit puberty, encouraged to explore themselves sexually. This would serve the end of not sublimating those repressed sexual desires to abstract ends like the state, the nation, or some symbol like the flag that they would be willing to die over, instead of having a patriotism to the local, to the community. Goodman said that this would not result in some kind of barbaric sexuality. Rather, it would provide a mean. It would be a mean between the promiscuity, where the human body was objectified under capitalism, and the boring monogamous marriages that people were plagued with. Rather, it would prevent the asocial behavior, antisocial behavior that was the result of the repression of sexuality. What were some of the new rights that Wilhelm Reich celebrated, Marcuse celebrated? Well, to liberate sexuality, things like abortion, doing away with the anti-homosexuality laws, a loosening of the divorce laws, and we'll get into that later, birth control, and then a new kind of sexual education. The third field where we find the radicals rejecting liberalism, probably the most important, was sociology. And one of the most important thinkers was C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was a brawling womanizer. He wore flannel shirts like the beats of the 1950s. He rode around on a motorcycle. He liked to be a fly in the ointment to antagonize professional academics. He argued that they, the grand theorists or the empiricists, weren't truly objective or impartial. Rather, they'd been bought off by large corporations. And so instead of doing the good of the public, rather they served special interests. This would later on be called capture theory. C. Wright Mills, along with Paul Goodman, Herbert Marcuse, was listed as the most important figure by many of the new left radicals in the 1960s. C. Wright Mills' critique of 1950s American liberal society was there was no difference between the parties, that the conservatives and the liberals were all the same, that they shared the same end. And he said the radicals were all disillusioned. He said that there hadn't been a left since the defeat of Henry Wallace in 1948. Rather, the Democrats had taken aim at the left wing. And so, as a radical, he wanted to revive the left, and he coined the phrase the New Left in 1960, and this resonated with many of the college students. What was his criticism of American society, liberal society? Well, Mills, following Eisenhower's own admission of a military-industrial complex, would point out that American society was not governed democratically. Rather, it was governed by what he called a power elite. And he looked at the military-industrial complex and the rise of expenditures. Instead of reducing the size of the military post the Korean War, the United States was spending rates at an all-time high. Expenditures in 1950 in the military were $12 billion, some 30% of the budget. And in 1955 were $40 billion, some 65% of the budget. John F. Kennedy, instead of de-escalation, scared Americans with the idea of a bomber or a missile gap that could be disproven, the idea we were falling behind the Soviets, and so we needed to spend vast amounts of money, in those areas alone some $9 billion, in an arms race. The United States is building more and more nuclear missiles, and the strategy that they're employing is mutually assured destruction. C. Wright Mills said this was nuts. He called it crackpot realism. The idea of realism had somehow concluded that the solution to the problem of nuclear war was that if the Soviets ever launched a nuclear missile at us, we would launch our missiles at them and everyone would die. And C. Wright Mills says, how is this the conclusion of supposedly intelligent intellectuals? So the military budget continues to expand. By 1970, it was $80 billion. But where was the money going? 2/3 of the $40 billion in C. Wright Mills' time has been spent on weapon systems that went to 15 corporations. 6/7 of those contracts were not competitive. In one Senate report, there were 100 defense contractors that held 67% of the contracts and employed 2,000 high-level former military officials. This was the revolving door. The CIA, which Truman had actually ordered disbanded, simply continued in the Pentagon. Under Truman, there was a whole double government where the intelligence agencies operated on their own. The CIA sent thousands of poorly trained insurgents to their deaths all over the world and to no good end. And so Mills said, we need a new left. There hadn't been one since Henry Wallace to challenge this liberal consensus. He attacked the idea of the end of ideology, which we've already seen was its own ideology, and he forwarded the idea of the utopian imagination. He said under this teaching of the end of ideology that the liberal-controlled media blunted the power to outrage. They would report a series of facts, but they wouldn't provide any context as to the broader social structural problems. And so C. Wright Mills said, we need intellectuals who will now address the problems of values, broad political problems. He said we need a, quote, politics of responsibility. He argued that there was a real danger that under liberal society, men could truly become what he called cheerless robots, a bunch of service sector workers who sold their personalities with their coffee in the morning. Rather, he said, we need to revive the values of reason and freedom that have developed in the West. He said that as radicals, we need the idea that we can transcend fate, not the mere conservative view that we're subjected to fate and certain inexorable laws of economics or natural law, any of those things. He said this view of the radicals is that we can change the system and thereby preserve these important values of reason and freedom. How then are we going to achieve a good society? Where would we find the groups that would resist liberal society and the power elite that made all of its decisions? He said private associations that used to exist have largely collapsed in American society. He said there's no longer a working class in the old Marxist theory. C. Wright Mills called this the labor metaphysic. He said all of these academic Marxists who lived in abstraction simply presumed that the laborers would rise up and overthrow the power elite. Rather, in American society, the labor unions themselves had been bought off. This was an argument also made by Herbert Marcuse. It meant that they were happier with shorter working days, a 40-hour work week, overtime pay. They just wanted more stuff. And in fact, it was within the labor unions themselves that the communists had been rooted out. So the blue-collar workers were not going to side with intellectuals to overthrow the power elite. So C. Wright Mills turned to the white-collar workers. He writes a book called White Collar in 1950. The white-collar workers, however, he argued, could not be made into a radical class. Rather, they were isolated, they were atomized in their little cubicles and offices, and they were channeled into materialistic consumption. And so C. Wright Mills said you couldn't turn to white-collar workers for a revolution to reclaim democracy against the power elite. And so he comes up with the idea of the craftsman. He calls it the sociological imagination. What the sociological imagination meant was that sociologists would reject the idea of studying facts as removed from values, and they would take responsibility for the structural inequities in their society. They would craft the symbols around which different publics would rally and be mobilized for a political movement. The key here for C. Wright Mills was the idea that the personal is the political. What kind of symbols would you choose? He said you should look to the sources of private unease, the kind of anxiety that people had in private life. And you would show them how that anxiety was related to broader structural problems. And then you could channel their personal anxieties towards politics. We'll see how this was applied in different movements, but civil rights is a good example. It's one that C. Wright Mills didn't participate fully in, but certainly alluded to. Let's say that in civil rights, you had sociologists who were able to construct the different symbols of an African-American identity. And then blacks in American society would know that the anxieties of their private life could be traced to broad racial inequalities in society, and then they could be mobilized for radical structural change. And this idea of personal politics, the feminists would say, the personal is the political, would be very important for a new era of identity politics. So, C. Wright Mills, Herbert Marcuse, those in critical theory, they would argue that there had to be a new alliance to challenge the power elite. They argued for a solidarity with different groups in society, no longer the blue-collar laborers, not the white-collar workers. So we've discussed the radical movements in academia and philosophy, in psychology and sociology. Let's conclude with this idea of the new proletariat. C. Wright Mills forwarded the idea that the, quote, young intelligentsia, as well as academics, they would unify with minority groups and third world revolutionaries. And that would be the basis of a movement for broad structural change. Mills wrote a book called Listen, Yankee. The point is that the United States was to blame for its sour relations with Cuba, and that many of these leaders in these third world countries, Fidel Castro, were actually correct to oppose U.S. intervention and influence. C. Wright Mills' idea was that intellectuals would have a special place. They would receive funding and travel privileges to go and advise the leaders of other countries. The United States, he suggested, should spend 20% of its GDP to build up the industrial base of these third world countries. Herbert Marcuse had a different idea of the proletariat, a new proletariat. Again, not the blue-collar workers. The intelligentsia would turn their back on them as only being reactionary, not being revolutionary. And he would talk about the old liberal character structure. He called it Promethean man. This was the idea of human beings who would work and labor in nature and would conquer nature, both in themselves and their repressed fantasies, as well as externally. They would harness the power of nature to build a society. And so looking at these character structures, Marcuse argued that the philosopher, he called it the narcissistic personality structure, means someone who loves himself, would unify with the poets, the artists. Here he had in mind countercultural musicians. They would unify with them in, quote, solidarity with women, minorities, and the, quote, wretched of the earth. That referred to the revolutionaries in the old colonial nations like Algeria. Marcuse said the elites must reject the, quote, conservative popular base for, quote, the substratum of the outcasts and the outsiders, the exploited and persecuted of other races and other colors, the unemployed and the unemployable, end quote. Marcuse even forwarded that a humane society would always provide a standard of living for people who refuse to work. In what Marcuse called the aesthetic state, he argued that there would be an end to, quote, surplus repression, that all would receive the material goods and conditions for self-actualization. The solution in terms of sexuality, he called polymorphous sexuality, that all of the citizens would be liberated from the, quote, inner-worldly asceticism of the Protestant work ethic. Marcuse asked the basic question, why are people working 12 hours a day, 10 hours a day, if all that's required is to work 4 hours a day to produce all of the consumer items that they need? With regard to sex, Marcuse at first argued that a revolution in sex would liberate individuals from monogamy and sex as attached to reproduction, to accept all the things they had called sexual perversion as good. In one more assessment of the new proletariat, we could look to the Black Power thinker Stokely Carmichael, who forwards the concept of Black Power in 1966. He said, quote, the American working class enjoys the fruits of the labors of the third world. The proletariat has become the third world, and the bourgeoisie is white Western society. And so we see here, in conclusion, that the radicals in challenging liberal society are going to assess that broad structural change is needed, and there will be a new alliance between the intellectuals and other disenfranchised groups to destroy the power elite.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about the history of the American left or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you will find 40 free online courses, including Constitution 101, The Real American Founding, American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate of completion. All our courses are free because we believe that these subjects will help you in your pursuit for virtue and happiness, and because a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for happiness and freedom at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.